Welcome, everyone. We are here today for Skag's policy on supporting Skag's training on supporting TDM through policy. Hopefully, we're all in the right place. Great, excellent. All right, well, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining everyone. As you may know, we held a series of trainings late last year meant to sort of provide an introduction to transportation demand management. And we are following that up with a second series. Gives us a deeper look into some of the topics that were of interest to folks who attended our first round of trainings. And so that's one of them today. So let's get everyone in and welcomed. And we're gonna start off here with some introductions. Just in the interest of time, we are not going to go around the full room, but we would love to hear from you. So please do use the chat function now. If you could let us know your name, your organization, and your job title. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about why you're interested in TDM policy. So if you want to get all of that written in the chat over the next minute or two, that would be great as folks are still logging in. And while you're doing that, I'll just give a quick intro for our team. My name is Julia Ween. I work for STEER. We are a consulting firm focused on transportation, and we've done lots of work in the TDM space, particularly within the Skag region, but also more broadly in California and internationally. We've worked with clients to both develop and implement TDM policy, and so we've seen lots of things that work really well and lots of challenges that agencies often struggle with. And so we're excited to talk through them with you today. I am joined today by my colleagues, Titi and Zoe, and you may run into them in a breakout discussion room later on in today's session. And we're also joined by Leslie Scott from Leslie Scott Consulting. She'll be monitoring the chat and helping to facilitate some of our Q&A session today. I'll take a quick pause here. And Leslie, if you don't mind taking a gander through the chat and letting us know who we have here with us today.
Thank you, Julia. So again, my name is Leslie Scott, and I see a lot of familiar faces. As Julia said, we've been doing TDM work in the region for a long time. So some of our colleagues have joined us, and I'd like to say we have a good representation today of LA County, Ventura County, Orange County, and San Bernardino County. And a few people to acknowledge. We have Hillary Norton, who we've done some interviewing with before for TDM Strategies. She was with the California Governor's Office. We also have some returnees from our past TDM workshops, and that's the folks from Torrance Transit and LAWA and Culver City, Palmdale, Inglewood. The names keep coming in. So again, I think we'll go ahead, but just want to again acknowledge everybody for coming and thanking you. And we will have opportunities throughout the presentation for some dialogue. So we look forward to today's presentation, Julia.
Excellent. Thank you, Leslie. And thank you again, everybody else for joining. We're really excited to have you here. I am actually going to turn over to Steve Fox from Skag, who's going to give a little bit of introduction on Skag and their efforts to support TDM.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Steve Fox with Skag. I'm project manager for TDM. Thanks for joining us today. For those of you who may not be familiar with Skag, we're the largest metropolitan planning organization in the country, both by land area and population. And one of the main things we do is every 4 years, a regional transportation plan / sustainable community strategy, which we submit to the federal government and work with many partners on that in the region. Back in 2019, we adopted a TDM strategic plan. And if you haven't looked at that, I encourage you to look at that. It's on our website under programs / transportation / TDM. And that was a big deal the first time that we had done a regional TDM strategy. And it contained 17 specific recommendations that we wanted to implement. And those 17 were within 5 categories: knowledge sharing, policy, partnerships, programming, and measurement. And the training sessions actually were a specific recommendation coming out of that plan. So we have begun implementing some of these. And it also contains a TDM toolbox of strategies, which includes 32 specific strategies and gives information on how best to implement them, their advantages, disadvantages, and so forth, what kind of environment they're best suited to, so on and so forth. So again, thanks for joining, and I'll turn it back over to Julia.
Excellent. Thanks, Steve. And as I mentioned at the start, and as Steve just alluded to as well, this training is part of a series of 6. They're each diving into different topics related to TDM. So our next training is coming up in just a few weeks. It's focusing on new mobility and TDM. We have more scheduled throughout the next couple months on the screen, so just keep an eye out for those announcements and visit the Skag website to register. So diving back into our agenda today, we're going to give a quick overview of TDM. If you've attended our other trainings, this may be old for you, but we do want to make sure that we give the context for anyone new. We'll try to go through it quickly. And then we'll be talking a little bit about what TDM policy is, what it looks like, and providing some tips for how to design and implement it successfully. And then we're going to break out into some groups for some more targeted discussion around policy. We'll allow you all to be in a smaller group, talk about some of the questions you may have, and use each other to brainstorm ideas. So I will dive right in here. And again, apologies if you've seen these slides before. I'll try to go through them quickly. But let's start with this question that we like to ask when we're talking about TDM. Why can't we drive alone? A few of the most important reasons that we see is generally driving alone would create traffic and congestion. More cars contributes to increased pollution and poorer air quality. And in addition to just the health consequences that are caused by poor air quality, driving everywhere and sitting in your car everywhere is not good for us. It causes stress. It's not good for your body to be sitting. So a few different really important reasons why we want to be thinking about getting people out of their cars. If you have any other suggestions or other reasons why we can't drive alone, feel free to use the chat to shout them out as well. Since we know we don't want everyone to drive alone, we use transportation demand management, or TDM, to help us cut back on that car use. So it helps us maximize the efficiency of our transportation systems. It helps us to reduce congestion, and it helps us to reduce vehicle emissions overall. And we seek to do that through TDM by encouraging habits that reduce the need for taking trips altogether. So switching to things like telehealth or teleworking, thinking about consolidating trips that might be able to be changed together. That results in fewer trips overall and usually fewer vehicle miles traveled overall. And then thinking about shifting trips out of single occupancy vehicles or drive alone and moving into other modes such as transit, carpooling, walking, biking. TDM programming typically exists to support a few different key goals. So the 3 big goals that we typically associate with TDM: first, supporting our economies by moving cars off of our roads that are often already overused and congestion. They reduce the cost of parking that employers or property owners have to provide for tenants, allowing them to use those funds for other things and providing benefits to make sites more attractive to tenants and support employee recruitment and retention. We've already talked a little bit about the environmental benefits, but I'll point out that in addition to just reducing GHG emissions and improving air quality, fewer cars also means that there's less space needed to be used for roads and for parking. And that might be more opportunities for open space across our areas and our regions. And then lastly, TDM and a reduction in vehicle usage overall really supports greater physical and mental well-being and more livable communities overall. So again, you may be familiar with TDM and with TDM strategies, but before we talk about how TDM can be regulated and formalized, we do want to take a minute to talk about what TDM strategies normally look like. So we often see them put into a few different buckets. You'll see them up on the screen here. First is education and marketing. So we know that a lot of people simply don't have a clear understanding of their options when it comes to travel. Driving just becomes the default. And so education and marketing is really all about ensuring that travelers know how they can get around and they understand how to take advantage of those options. So they know how they can purchase their fares, they know where they can catch the bus, they know how to bike safely. Beyond just education, TDM also often involves encouraging travelers to use non-driving options. So that's through programs that either make those options more attractive or even easier to use. So things like connecting carpool riders or providing guaranteed ride home for commuters who might be weary of traveling by transit otherwise. Next, we often hear about TDM or non-supportive or non-SOV supportive infrastructure that employers, cities, or site developers can put into place to help encourage the use of other modes. So that's things like developing bike parking or creating sidewalk access. And next is parking. This is often managed in ways to discourage driving alone and to encourage the use of other modes. So most simply, that often involves just pricing or charging for parking. But other strategies like unbundling parking or providing short-term options can be helpful as well. And then lastly, we include TDM policy as a bucket itself here, as it often helps to encourage even more TDM delivery. Obviously, that's what we're here to talk about today. But we do want to show that TDM policy can really encompass all of these buckets. And so we do have these icons sort of sprinkled throughout the presentation when we're talking about examples, just to show how that can be the case. So before we move on, just a quick pop quiz here. Please use the chat function, and we'd love it for you to enter in strategies that have worked really well for your agency or that you've seen work well in other places. And Leslie, as some of those come in, if you want to just read some of those out, that would be super helpful.
Right, well, people are putting it in. I just also want to mention that we do have some of our participants who have a lot of experience in ride sharing, and that's Renee from Cal State San Bernardino. And we've also got some interest specifically saying some people are looking at TDM ordinances, such as Diane from Culver City, and let's see, Nick from Burbank. So again, I think that's great that we've got people already looking at their current policy and seeing what they can do to enhance it. So right now, what we do have here is, let's see, Alexander is letting us know that they are using the parking pricing as a strategy. As you mentioned, there is some policy at the state level. So it'll be interesting for us to see how that works on the local level. And also from OCTA, we have Angel and saying that they have policies that specifically relate to what a lot of us have been experiencing during COVID, and that is flex schedules and some remote work policies, along with some incentives. So these, again, are different strategies, and we'll see how they actually play into the policy. So I'll let you take it over again, Julia.
Sorry, trying to find my mute there. Thanks, Leslie, and thanks for folks who were able to put some of these in the chat. We will keep going here. And just keeping in mind, again, that all of those types of strategies can really be incorporated into policy in different ways. All right, so let's talk about what TDM policy is and how we typically see it. So for the purpose of today's training, we're going to define TDM policy. It's something that is meant to increase TDM activity, either at the local or the site level. And it does that either by encouraging or requiring strategies that aim to decrease single occupancy vehicle trips or vehicle miles traveled. So essentially, TDM policy encourages or requires TDM strategy or delivery itself. So if you've attended some of our previous trainings, this list might be familiar to you, but we think it's really important to look at who implements TDM strategy in general before we look at how it's being regulated. We see TDM strategy and policy and programming really come through a wide range of practitioners, all the way from the federal level down to individual sites. But when we look at TDM policy, I think typically we're looking generally at sort of larger or broader level agencies providing guidance or regulation to those below them. So you can kind of see on the list on the screen here how that often flows down. We're going to focus on sort of 3 key areas in our discussion today. It doesn't mean that policy can't exist differently, but this is sort of where we typically see it when it comes to TDM. So first being the state and federal government, their policies related to TDM impact pretty much all TDM delivery below them. So they can take shape in things like environmental target setting or grant funding program development. Then particularly here in the Skag region, we see the air districts, which are relatively unique to California in the way that their rules and policies support TDM delivery, but they play an important role providing policy both for the jurisdictional and the site levels. And then lastly, at the city and county level, policies often impact individual sites. So sometimes these policies are very specific TDM ordinances, and sometimes TDM comes through smaller elements in policy documents, so things like specific or general plans as well. So before we dive into some examples, let's take a look at why agencies might be interested in implementing TDM policy to start. So first, and probably the most basic here, is just to increase the level of TDM delivery that's happening in a state or a region or an area or a city. We know that TDM can help achieve environmental and economic development objectives. We just talked about that a second ago. And so supporting more of it can help those agencies reach their economic and environmental targets as well. Another reason to utilize TDM policy is to ensure that TDM strategies are being delivered directly to the people whose behavior we want to change. So the state of California, for example, can only do so much to reach individuals, but if they're working closely with cities and with sites that have their own mechanisms for outreach and for education, they're going to be able to reach those individuals more directly. And then sort of building off of that, encouraging TDM to be implemented by sort of these lower, for lack of a better word, levels often helps to ensure that the programming itself is designed to support the people who will be using it. So for example, if an employer is located in a non-transit accessible area, they might want to consider strategies related to carpooling instead of providing free transit passes, and allowing TDM policy to support delivery at a smaller or lower level allows that to happen a bit more easily. And then lastly, TDM policy often suggests or requires that data collection come from the folks who are covered by policies. And that helps agencies collect more complete data, which is great. But it also helps them to standardize the data being collected across their region or their jurisdiction. And just a little plug here that we will talk more about data standardization in the entire Skag region in a couple months in our last training of this series, so do keep an eye out for that as well. So as I've alluded to already, when we think of how agencies enact TDM policy, we really see sort of 2 separate kinds. First is encouragement, and so that's policy that sort of incentivizes or supports TDM delivery across sites or across cities. This is seen through things like provision of funds or formalized support structures, TMA development, that type of thing. Second is sort of the stick to the carrot, and that's the type of policy that requires that TDM strategies be provided or delivered, again, often on a city or a site level. There are pros and cons to each, and we're going to go into each of them, and we're going to start here with encouragement. So encouragement policy, as I mentioned, typically includes things like density bonuses, policy that establish or forms TMAs. On a federal level, we see the Pretax commuter benefit. And all of these types of policy make it easier for sites or jurisdictions to implement TDM without requiring that they do it or providing any kind of stick type regulation. some of the benefits of encouragement strategies are that they typically allow for lots of flexibility in how their support can materialize into TDM. So unsurprisingly, they're often much easier to implement as well, and they often leave the groups who will ultimately be implementing the TDM with more control to make decisions. So they have a bit more flexibility there. On the flip side, though, encouragement policy obviously can't enforce how TDM is implemented or even that it is implemented at all. So because of this, if implementers don't take advantage of the policy, it can mean that it's less effective or it may reach smaller audiences. Similarly, these types of policies also make it more difficult to collect complete data for an area or for a region because there's less control over who is actually collecting the data. A few sort of elements on the screen here on the bottom for policymakers to consider when they're thinking about encouragement policy are thinking about the policy in the long term. Will it be sustainable? Thinking about who will be responsible for managing or implementing the policy or program after its establishment. And we'll get into that later in the presentation. And then also thinking about risks if the policy is establishing some type of support structure that it can't maintain in the long run. So again, for example, if a support strategy establishes a funding source for TDM and then that source needs to go away because the agency can't maintain it or doesn't have the internal capacity to maintain it, what does that mean for that program, for the folks who are receiving that funding, and what does that mean to TDM delivery in the long term? So an example here of a TDM encouragement policy in the city of Los Angeles is thinking about their transit-oriented communities program. So this is a policy that's largely focused on infrastructure and parking. You can see the little icons there on the side of the screen. And it incentivizes residential development and increased affordable housing, but particularly in areas where residents are less likely to need cars and are therefore more likely to take advantage of transit and rail travel. The policy allows developers to build more than they might be able to elsewhere and also build fewer parking spots. And as you may know, parking can be extremely expensive to build. So essentially, this program allows developers to make and to save more money by locating close to multimodal options and encouraging fewer single occupancy vehicle trips that way. And moving on here to the requirement side of things, you may be familiar with policies like South Coast AQMD's Rule 2202, which we'll talk about in a minute, citywide ordinances like the one in Santa Monica, which we talk about a lot here in the Skag region, and also statewide policies, so things like California's parking cash out code. When you're requiring someone to do something, you do have often greater participation, and that typically will mean more TDM delivery across your policy area, your city, or your region. So that is certainly a pro of requirement policy. Because these types of policies may also expose different groups or different individuals to TDM who might not otherwise utilize it or conduct TDM on their own, that also means that we're getting more exposure to TDM in general across your city or your area or your region. And then lastly, when reporting is required as part of a requirement policy, it means that there's pretty good potential for really accurate and all-encompassing data collection across an area. So that's something that agencies typically like to see as part of their requirement policies. On the other side, though, requirement policies are not usually effective if they're not enforced. And enforcement requires staff time and money to maintain. They're obviously also more difficult to enact because you're requiring people to do things. And so that can result in pushback from the development communities, from others. And then lastly, depending on how requirement policies are set up, they can sometimes push towards sort of a more one-size-fits-all approach rather than allowing implementers to structure programs the way that's best for them. And again, that just depends on exactly how they're put together. When considering requirement policies, a couple things for policymakers to think about. First, how will they make sure that this policy is enforced and maintained? And again, we'll talk a little bit more about this later today, but really, really important. We see lots of policy in California that exists on paper, but is not enforced, it's not maintained, it's not monitored. And so in real life, it doesn't actually hold any weight and it doesn't really result in any additional TDM programming. Policymakers should also consider how much time and funding both the development of a policy and the long-term implementation of a policy will require, and then what legal constraints might impact the way the policy is able to remain in place and be effective. So I mentioned already the South Coast AQMD's Rule 2202, but this is a pretty all-encompassing example for lots of folks in the Skag region, not the full region, but the South Coast Air District. So this rule applies to every employer in the Air District with 250 or more employees. It requires that those employers either provide their own TDM programs to mitigate the emissions that are coming from their employees' commutes, or pay a fee or purchase emission reduction credits to sort of make up for those commute emissions. So employers are required to report annually, and those who do choose to implement TDM are required to survey their employees and track their progress year over year. And those who do provide TDM are allowed to sort of create their own bespoke programs, choosing from a menu of options. And you know, one of the more unique things about this policy right now is that South Coast AQMD really does have the jurisdiction to enforce this rule and take legal action against employers who aren't in compliance. And one more quick example here. We've talked a little bit about how policies can support or work with different TDM strategies and different types of strategies. And we wanted to give an example of how the same TDM strategy can really be used both in an encouragement and requirement type of policy. So some of you may be familiar with the Pretax Benefit from the federal government. So this allows employers to give their employees the option of deducting up to $280 per month of their commute cost. So it comes out of their paycheck before taxes are applied. The employees don't pay taxes on it. And so this policy helps employees by saving them a bit of money for their commute. It also helps employers because employers are also not required to pay taxes on that money if it's deducted beforehand. So this benefit is optional for employers across the country, but in Washington, D.C., they've actually implemented a requirement policy really based on the federal government's policy. So D.C. Requires that all employers with 20 or more employees provide this benefit program to their employees. So we can see how the pre-tax benefit comes from the federal government as a type of encouragement and then can be utilized by local governments to require TDM delivery on a smaller level. All right, so we're going to have a quick quiz here. We've talked a little bit about encouragement and requirement policies, and we're going to pull up the poll and ask you to spot the difference. Let's see. Can we get that poll up here? Great. So we have 4 types of policies here, and I think you can choose as many as you'd like. And we want you to let us know which of these policies here are encouragement policies. Couple answers coming in here. Great. Excellent. All right, let's just give it a couple more seconds for folks to fill out the poll if you haven't had a chance yet. Great, great. And it looks like all of you have been paying attention and know your stuff here. Typically, what we consider to be encouragement policies are those first 2. So thinking about voluntary membership with the TMA, thinking about implementing the federal tax benefit programs. Things like TDM plan requirements for new developers are often policies that require developers to do things. So we sort of put those in the stick pot rather than the carrot pot. And while we're thinking that through, just want to pause here for a moment. If folks have questions about encouragement or requirement policies or anything else that we've gone over so far, feel free to throw them in the chat or pipe up.
Hi, Julia. Oh, go ahead.
Did we have someone with a question? Yeah, I don't see any hands.
Hey, Julia, I thought I heard the same thing as well, but I guess not. I know that Hillary had her camera open, so I wondered if she still was interested in making a comment. Again, Hillary has been the executive director of Fast Link downtown LA and downtown LA TMO, so voluntary TMO as well, I believe. And then also, if Lynn wanted to say anything from Anaheim Transportation Network, who also had started operating as a transportation management organization. So if anybody wants to say anything, now is a good time. And if not, then Julia will continue.
All right, I'm not seeing anything, Leslie, so I will keep moving. I'm just gonna, I think we ended the poll here, so we should be good to go. All right, great. So now that we have a nice basic understanding of what TDM policy can look like, what encouragement versus requirement looks like, we're going to go into some of the ways that we make sure policies are designed and implemented successfully. So we have 4 main tips that we're going to go over today. I call these our guiding principles, and we'll go into each one in a little bit more detail in a moment, but I'll just run through them quickly first. So first is defining your goals and objectives. This is really the most important step, and it should help to shape every other decision that you make during your policy development. We talked a little bit earlier about the reasons why agencies utilize TDM. So this should come into the conversation here. So for example, if your main goal is related to economic development, it might be more important that your policy involve the business community and require them to participate or encourage them to participate. Whereas if your goal is more around congestion reduction or air quality, that may be less important to you. Second, it's important for us to think about our audiences, engage our audience's appetite. So obviously, writing policy and pushing it through review and approval processes is often a long and drawn out process. So it's really important to consider that process as you develop the structure for your policy. So this is where you might need to draw the line between the types of requirement versus encouragement that we've been discussing. Do you have an audience that will respond well to being required to do something, or is that something that's less feasible for your audiences? Third here, you'll need to understand your internal capacity. So I mentioned we frequently do see TDM policy that's developed and it's codified, and then it's not really actioned and it's not really enforced. It sort of defeats the purpose of creating a policy altogether because nobody's paying attention to it or following it. And so really for both encouragement and requirement type policies, typically the development process should involve at least some consideration of your ongoing support from the agency that's implementing the policy. So you'll want to consider what those needs are and whether your team or folks you could partner with have the capacity to support them in the long term. And then lastly, building off capacity is funding, our favorite topic, of course. You'll want to think sort of both short and long term here. There's a cost to creating and developing and ratifying your policy. but there's also potential funding required for long-term maintenance, thinking about creating supportive guidelines or tools that might accompany the policy, and any other ongoing costs, communication, enforcement, that type of thing. So we're going to go into each of these and we'll talk a little bit about some of the questions that we as policymakers want to ask ourselves as we think through each of these principles. So we're going to start with first our defining our goals and objectives. We'll want to think really first about agencies' priorities. Are there other policies or guidelines that we want to be fitting within? We see congestion and air quality objectives as being related, and they are. But if your agency is focused on one or the other, you may actually want to structure your policy a little bit differently. So a good example here is Rule 2202 from South Coast AQMD. It requires employers to survey their employees for morning commutes because the morning peak hour typically results in poor air quality. However, some cities like Burbank and Santa Monica, who are more focused on congestion, also want to consider the afternoon peak hour because that is where there's typically more congestion. So Burbank's policy, for example, outlines specific requirements for PM peak hour surveying. So those are the types of things you'll want to consider when thinking about how your goals are going to shape the policy and the way that it's implemented. The second one here is you'll want to understand whether there are targets you're trying to reach. So maybe those are targets that are dictated by long-range plans or other broader policy, either for your agency or policy from the regional or state level that your agency is trying to fit within. So data collection from your TDM policy in itself might not single-handedly help you achieve all of your overarching emission reduction goals. But you'll still likely want to structure any data collection or evaluation processes around your policy to be able to show progress towards that goal. So that might mean considering TDM models, things like the TRIMS model or the TDM ROI calculator, which exists for free use across the country, or thinking about bespoke VMT calculator tools. Again, just making sure that the TDM strategies that are ultimately implemented can show progress towards VMT reduction goals, greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, whatever your agency is really focused on. And now thinking a bit more about the audience who will be impacted by our policies and how to design policies that will be most successful for them. So you'll want to think about how open a requirement, style, or regulation they may be open to. So for example, if your agency is trying to attract new employment or new development, it might be more difficult to put additional requirements onto those types of players. If you're thinking about encouragement, things like funding provision, what makes the most sense for your area or for your audience? Should your agency be the one implementing TDM, or should you consider providing encouragement opportunities like grants or mini grant programs for others to provide their own delivery? If you are specifying strategies, so things like the DC policy that we mentioned, that specifies that employers need to provide the pre-tax benefit, are those strategies that you're specifying aligned with the type of modal options or trip types that your audience typically uses? So again, is a transit-focused strategy sensible in an area where there might be less transit access, things like that. And then lastly, are there other policies that exist already that might impact how you should design yours? So one that lots of folks in this group will likely run into is SB 743. Often that's going to result in developers committing to TDM strategies to mitigate their VMT impacts. So if you're in a city that is trying to create its own TDM policy separate from SB 743, you may want to consider what projects have already committed to in terms of how they're going to report their TDM delivery to avoid making things too complicated or requiring duplicate reporting processes, really trying to keep things as streamlined and easy as possible for the folks who are going to need to be complying with your policy. And next here, and this is one that I feel I really can't stress enough, is really understanding your internal capacity. And this is really important, making sure that before you define your policy, you have the ability to manage it in the long term. So first, one thing that seems basic, but often does sort of come into the policy discussion a little bit late, is what do our agencies actually have control over? So this should almost always involve a conversation with your legal team early. We sometimes see legal teams brought into these processes a bit late, and they come in and say this is not something we can do, and then the whole process needs to sort of start from square one again. And so really, really important to involve them early and make sure that they're included in the entire process. They can sort of help understand both what can be controlled and then also how policies can be enforced. And obviously we're going to come to that as we think about the long-term management. Definitely, we are not providing any legal advice as part of this training, and we certainly suggest that you consult with your legal teams for any policy decisions. But one thing that I'll mention in terms of sort of legal capacity and things that we've seen implemented successfully are thinking about providing options to folks if you are requiring that they implement or deliver TDM. So Rule 2202 and the City of Santa Monica's ordinance, they're able to implement, or they allow employers to implement TDM programs on site, or employers can take advantage of options that may be more expensive but don't require the TDM delivery. So it gives a couple options, and we've seen that help legal processes move a little bit more smoothly. You still have a bit of control over how your policy is presented. So in Santa Monica, for example, more employers take advantage of sort of the TDM delivery option because of the way it's presented. And for Rule 2202, there's a bit more of a mix across employers that are required to participate. So outside of sort of the legal breadth, it's really also important to consider what is actually required of your agency to develop and implement the policy. Are there ongoing reporting requirements that you're considering? If so, how are you going to keep track of everyone who's required to participate? Even from an encouragement standpoint, you want to think about this. You'll want to ensure that people understand that your policy exists, that they're taking advantage of it. So do you have the budget or the staff time to support that outreach and that marketing to make sure that your policy is being implemented or used successfully? And then last here on the capacity principle is just thinking about the feasibility and the requirements of your policy versus the impact that you expect to achieve. And so it's really striking that balance of creating a policy that's not so detailed or so in depth that it can't actually be implemented, but one that has enough behind it, either from a funding perspective or a requirement perspective, that it'll allow you to achieve the objectives that you're looking for. And so really thinking about where that balance lies, and it's different for every agency. And so it's something that you'll want to sit down and think about at the start. And then our last principle here is considering funding structures. And this is always a fun one. We like to make sure that funding is being considered in two different ways. First, thinking about the development of your policy itself. So that includes things like conducting outreach with your stakeholders to understand what type of policy will be most successful, writing your policy language, participating in public meetings and getting the policy actually passed politically. We often see short-term grants support this type of work, so you can consider things like the Sustainable Communities grants distributed through Skag, or CMAQ funds, which are distributed in the Skag region through the CTCs. Longer term, though, you also need to ensure that you have the funding to maintain your policies. We've talked about this a bunch. There's only so much I can hammer it in. But again, it's really, really important to make sure that you have a plan for how to implement your policies long-term, and that includes funding. So grant sources like CMAQ can support long-term programming, but you may also want to consider thinking about long-term regular funding sources. So things like tying your TDM policy implementation and admin to parking revenue or registration fees. One note just to consider among this group is that if you're thinking about SB 743 related fee programs, the Mitigation Fee Act does require that impact fees support infrastructure projects rather than ongoing programs. So that's something we've run into a little bit in California, and something to just think about as you're considering your long-term funding sources. It just may be more of a difficult approach. All right, so we are going to wrap up here with just a few last minute tips and tricks before we send us all into groups to talk about this in a little bit more detail. So first, avoid surprises and make sure you're engaging your stakeholders. This is really true with any political process. We want to make sure that community members and relevant stakeholders are involved in the process of developing your TDM policy, not just able to comment at the end. This will allow you to avoid surprises that come from angry stakeholders, but also, of course, it's just best practice to ensure that our policies are truly being designed to help the people that we're trying to help. Next, we want to consider partnerships. So particularly, we find this useful when we're thinking about long-term policy implementation. So locally in the Skag region, for example, we have a couple of cases of TMAs that are non-governmental agencies, so nonprofit, separate organizations, who are in charge of collecting data from their members annually and reporting back to the city agencies. So this takes some of the administrative responsibility off of the cities themselves and allows it to come through the TMAs. And the city's policies help support the TMAs, help support their existence, but it just takes some of the pressure off of the cities as well. Next, we always recommend pilot programs, just making sure that you have an opportunity to roll out any kinks in your reporting process, get a really good understanding of sort of the level of effort that's required from your agency to maintain that policy. Again, you don't want to end up with surprises when you've planned for one FTE to manage this program long-term, and then all of a sudden you find out you need 5. So pilot programs help you really establish that understanding and set you up for success moving forward. Next, we've talked about encouragement and requirement, but we really like to see the two working together. So a really good example is over in Santa Monica, where the city fully sponsors the TMO. It allows the TMO to provide full support for employers. You know, they're not focused on increasing membership. They're really able to just provide programming to the employers, who then on the flip side are required to deliver TDM and report to the city annually. Similarly, across the South Coast Air District, the CTCs provide programming to support employers who are required to comply with Rule 2202. And lastly here is just don't be afraid to start small. So of course, we always support the provision of full-scale, large TDM ordinance requirements if they make sense for agencies and their audiences. But that's not realistic for everyone. It's not realistic everywhere. And so the example I gave earlier of the Pretax Benefit requirement in DC, I think is a good one of sort of starting off with something simple and manageable rather than diving into, you know, a full TDM program requirement for every employer. And DC is actually now sort of jumping off of that and implementing a parking cash out policy. And so there's always opportunity to sort of grow and expand your policy if you start at a smaller scale. And that is it for our information for you today. So what we're hoping to do, we have about 40 minutes left, and I think it's okay if we wrap up a little early if we don't need that full time. But we'd love to break everyone out into groups, and TT and Zoe and I are going to lead discussions, and we have a couple guiding questions if we need them, but we really do want to give you all an opportunity to ask your questions, maybe talk through some of your unique situations, and brainstorm a bit and figure out how to help set you best up for success for your policies.
Hi, everybody. We're just going to wait a minute or so for the rest of the participants to come back from their breakout rooms. Let's see. Perhaps Leslie, I don't know if you might know anything about Simpson's question regarding lawsuits, but do you know anything about lawsuits relating to TDM policies, or either on TDM policies maybe not producing actionable results, or maybe lawsuits on the other end, maybe developers thinking that TDM policies are too stringent? Do you have any knowledge or experience with TDM lawsuits?
Let's see. So I do have not so much some experience, but I I am not a lawyer. I have lawyer friends. But to answer your question, there has been some challenges directly with the Air Quality Management District. There have been some lawsuits, and that information can be let's see, acquired by the, the public information.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, the city of Santa Monica did have, don't believe it became a lawsuit, but there was a Information Act request that was surrounded by the question of what is being mitigated for different developments from a citizens group. So that's slightly different than you asking about developers. As far as developers go, my experience working and actually implementing and enforcing the TDM requirements for developers in West Hollywood was that the city actually wanted to make sure they didn't get into a lawsuit. So they made sure that there was conversations before some of the mitigation measures were put together. So I would not say that it's become extremely litigious within the TDM world.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. I don't know if you caught the end of that, Simpson, but I hope that kind of answers some of your question. And it's something to think about going forward. How do you avoid this type of lawsuit from occurring? But welcome back, everybody.
Thanks, Zoe and Leslie. It's interesting to get an overview of what you guys were talking about in your rooms. Just want to give us a minute or two if there was anything interesting from the breakout groups that we want to bring to the main stage. It sounds like you guys were talking about sort of legal action against requirement style policies. Is that right?
Yes. So there was a question of sort of what my experience might have been in the LA region. And basically my answer was there have not been a lot of lawsuits. There have been either inquiries about how does the law affect different groups, whether that's citizens or whether it's developers themselves. And then the AQMD has had lawsuits with the different rules.
Great, Leslie. Sorry, my fire alarm is going off behind me. So
that's okay. Well, just a minute, Julie. While I was waiting for the breakout rooms to do their thing, I noticed in my feed, Colleen over at Santa Monica had sent a message about their ordinance, them getting their ordinance ready to go. So I just thought I'd share that with the group that looks like Santa Monica's actual ordinance. And again, they've had TDM programming, they've had some policies, but their actual ordinance is going to be hot off the press. So it's always good to know what the current policies are with different agencies. So we'll try to share that with Santa Monica, as well as I know Julia has worked on the ordinance for the city of West Hollywood. And of course, Pasadena has had a long-standing ordinance. So while Julia's calming things down at home, I just thought I'd share that with everybody, that those are good resources. We talked about that in our last training about partnerships and resources. And I know the folks at all of those agencies will be happy to share any information that you would need.
Thanks,
Just gonna piggyback up that. Sorry. We had a question about TDM. We had quite a few questions about TDM ordinances in our own group in terms of TDM updates, especially when you have like older employers and older members not being held to the same standard as newer folks. We weren't able to answer that question in our own group, so we figured we could bring it to the main group. So since we're talking about TDM ordinances, I figured I could post the question here.
So thinking about just how to put requirements on new development that is not necessarily in place on old development.
Yeah, like older developments are up for some areas, older developments are required less than newer development. They have like less requirements made. So how do they mitigate that? So.
Yeah, I think, that's a tough one, and legally there, it's much easier, I think, to put policies or requirements in place for newer sites. One of the things that we do in Warner Center is the requirement in the specific plan in Warner Center only applies to new building as well. But what we do from a TMO standpoint is we provide a discount to existing services or existing structures so that they're able to come in and work with us at, for a little bit cheaper. And Hillary, I see you have your hand raised if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, I do. I wanted to ask about this, which I think it's a really important point, especially as we're looking at downtown where there's so much new construction about to happen, and the reporting requirements are different. And there's a lot of other information that I do think it's going to be interesting to see how like legacy buildings and new construction is going to be treated differently. I also wanted to ask about AB 2548 and the fact that that is supposed to be now implemented, and that we need to be asking about not just the Rule 2202, but that AB 2548 requires commute plans for buildings, businesses with 50 or more employees, and how you've seen that get implemented and where that is with Metro, because I think they've been interested in seeing a new set of plans take place.
Yeah, thanks, Hillary. And unfortunately, I don't know if we have anyone from Metro on the call. I don't have the exact status of it. My understanding was that the commute plans are going to be really focused, sort of like what we've seen in DC, around providing the pre-tax benefit, rather than every employer with over 50 employees needing to put together a full-scale TDM plan, more similar to Rule 2202.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have the sort of timeline on that one though, Hillary. I know it's out there. Do we have anyone from Metro on the call that wants to speak to that?
We do.
Oh, great.
We do. We have Jill from Metro, Jill Liu from Metro. Let's see who else. So
Yeah,
Jill,
hi.
if you
Yeah,
have
I'm
any
from Metro. But I'm not
comments?
TDM policy specialist. I'm actually new to the TDM planning, so that's why I'm calling in for this training. But if you need more information, I could reach out to my colleague who's actually in the TDM program.
That would be great, because I know Devin Deming and
Yes.
Jacqueline, we helped support and push forward the AB 2548. And so I know there was an effort to see that there would be actually a lot more. Again, it wasn't supposed to be sort of onerous, but really an exciting opportunity for there to be recognition about TDM and TMAs and TMOs, so that we could bring more people into the planning of like better commutes.
Yeah. So how should I? Who should I? I guess I could contact my colleague to get more information. But who should I send the information to? To Julia? And
Yeah,
you
that would be
forward-
great, Jill. And
Okay.
let me know if it would be helpful for me to reach out to you, and we can just send an update to the folks who were in attendance today in case you're interested.
Okay, yeah, I don't have your email. If you could just drop your email in the chat, and I could email
Or
you.
I'll thread in the chat.
Um,
And just for folks who are not familiar, this is something that would impact LA County specifically. So something for folks who are working with Metro and employers in the LA County area to
Right, since again, Devin and Hillary and some folks that have been in the TDM industry for a long time, like you say, we're looking at as something that was going to be exciting and actually enhance commuting, both opportunities and programming. Again, it's fairly new. If Hillary, did you want to give a little brief discussion about sort of the evolution of it? Because I think it's really interesting, especially since we're talking about policy. And yeah, let me have you just talk about that.
Sure. One of the other roles I play is that I am also on the California Transportation Commission, and I am a former chair of the commission. And one of the things that we have been doing like early on, and with Assembly Member Friedman, who's now the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee and an ex officio on the commission, she really wanted to see like what are the things that we could do to push more businesses to participate in mobility programs. And so AB 2548 was actually intended to be an opportunity for public-private partnerships to have more of the private sector understand their role in reduce VMT and improving air quality and improving the mobility of the region. And so what was exciting about AB 2548 was that unlike the AQMD rule 2202, where I think the business community was not in favor of it for a while, AB 2548 was one that actually the business community really favored and said, you're right, this is a time where we need to start doing our part. And certainly at the time, transportation and the lack of funding and the need for more investment was really high on everyone's agenda, public and private. And so that's why I think 2548 is really a unique experience in the role of TDM and TMAs and TMOs, because there's a big recognition that we do need more of these like push opportunities to get people to think about what's available and to start educating the business community as to how to participate in these programs and encourage their workforce to do so. So I like this particular bill because this is one where unusually everybody's saying, yes, I know this is a regulation on us, but we actually think it's time to do it. And so that's why I'm really excited about what that rollout could be. And it really got stymied because of COVID, because it was supposed to sort of go into effect in the January 1st of 2020. And so I think there's been this sense of like, well, let's just slow it down because it's just another thing to do. But I think it's really timely now to get back on that ability to have the conversation and move forward as we are going to look at what makes a really good commute plan and what are the tools in the toolbox. And so I think this is a really timely opportunity to get the private sector back in the conversation, because they want to know what the tools in the toolbox are. They really want to get people back to work and are feeling a little bit stymied as to, what are the things that they could add as part of the worker retention and attraction tools. I did also want to, and so one of the things that we got a lot of questions about from the business community is that as a state, California still hasn't allowed officially the change in work hours for like many businesses. That there isn't an official, that when you want to officially change the ability for major businesses to offer different shifts and like a 980 or other work plans, that there still is on the state level a reluctance to allow that because of a lot of labor pushback. So I was wondering, in your other cities and other counties, how you've been able to handle it, or is it just sort of ad hoc, and because of COVID, people have, and we're now sort of in this like very hybridized work experience and how people have their work rules. I was just wondering if anyone's come up against that, because a lot of the business community's actually been trying to officially change that in California law so that they could officially offer these other work schedules, and have been told, no, we're still at the 5-day week, 40 hours a week work week, because a lot of unions like to use that as an organizing tool to say you can only offer these other work weeks if you unionize. So I'd love to hear where your businesses are, or what you've been hearing about the potential to change that, since it's such a great TDM strategy too.
Thanks, Hillary. Thanks for the overview and moving the discussion along. We have just about 4 minutes left, so I'll open the floor if anyone wants to speak on sort of changing work hours and using different types of work weeks as a TDM strategy. Does anyone run into that from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I'll just add that similar to many policies and strategies, some of the best approaches is to see what's already existing, either legislation or policy or something similar in your industry, right? And so a good place to start is to cite the telework legislation, which is federal. Again, though, to Hillary's point, it's not with private, but if the policy can get introduced based on doing some research that this policy is working at these different levels and within these different sectors. And so there is something already established, as we know, with the federal government.
Can you send a copy of the federal telework policy to
Yes.
people? That's great. I'd love to start with that, and I wasn't aware of it. Thank you.
Great. Well, it sounds like there are a couple of resources that it would be helpful to send along. And I think that's, really important when we're thinking about policy. As you mentioned, Hillary, it's kind of what exists and what can we be building off of. So what we can do, and Steve, I hope this is okay, is sending out some resources to this group today for folks who are interested.
Oh, sure, definitely.
Okay, excellent. Well, we'll plan to do that. And we have just 2 minutes left, and what we typically like to do in our last 2 minutes is ask you to please take the time to fill out our feedback survey. We're going to put it in the chat here, and it's just a minute or two letting us know what you thought worked well, where we could improve for the next few trainings. And feel free to, as we're getting some resources together, if there's anything else that you think would be useful, let us know in the feedback survey, and we can try to dig it up and include it for you all. So I think otherwise that is it. Big thank you to Leslie and to Zoe and TT and Steve for helping us move forward today, and to Jennifer from Skag. We really appreciate you all joining us, and we will see you in a couple of weeks for our training on new mobility.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone.
Thank you.